Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're up to part 8. Now, will I hold this up? There you are. Now, I call this my clapperboard. You know how in Hollywood they have lights, camera, action and so on? Well, I can't handle that. I have no assistant, but nevertheless, this gives me that Hollywood feeling. But it also allows me to keep track of the numbers. Now, what I wanted to do today, minus the crow chorus that you may have heard the other day, and so I've closed doors and windows and all this to be free of the wretches. They like this area for some reason or another. Well, I think they find a certain charm in me, I think. But anyway, I'm keeping them out. What I wanted to do today was to have a look at the question of the naming of Charleville. Now, that was not a matter that puzzled people's minds very much in the 19th century, although there was one traveller, maybe the sketcher, but I'm not quite sure, who did ask the question when he visited Charleville in about 1898, I think it was the year. Well, he didn't get much of a response because it appeared that people weren't all that much interested in it, and he said, well, you know, it's possible that it was named after Tully's hometown in Ireland, or named after Charleville in Ireland, or something like that. He was pretty vague about it. And so, you know, it wasn't a burning question. What's his name? McMahon mentioned it in 1925, and he must have asked someone, and he came up with the notion that it was named after Tully's birthplace, or where he spent his boyhood. I can't remember quite how he said it. Maybe where he spent his boyhood or childhood years, or something like that. But then when you get into the period from 1929 and into the 30s, this is the period of the Tully reminiscences. And not only Tully reminiscences, but also the reminiscences of the Tully reminiscences by, say, Father Flynn, and then a bit later by Alan Morrison. And then, based, I think, on probably what the Tullys had to say, not the Tullys, why do I say that? I'm really getting quite weak in the head, you know. On what the Janetzky descendants chose to say. They came up with this story that, it was named Tully's birthplace, Tully's boyhood home, Tully's mother, all of those things, you see. And of course, people accepted that this was probably so, even though there was no evidence other than the assertions of the Tully memoirs that it was based on this town of Charleville in Ireland. And this became the probable reason, even though no one says we know why and that he named it. And so it's always been an open question, and the general consensus is that, he probably did. Now, I used to hope that there was some sort of evidence available that said that he didn't. Now, the reason that I thought that was that as I've been reading about Tully and what went on out there, and reading the newspaper articles and reading some of the internal documents from the Lands Department of that period, I haven't come away with a great liking for Tully, and I may do him a great injustice. He may have been a sweet-natured and very approachable man, but that's not the impression that I had, or have rather. And so even though I began by thinking that, I hope he didn't, I've sort of in recent days changed my mind about that. I think he probably did. And I have no more evidence than the next person about whether he did or whether he didn't, and so I'm not going to give a conclusive proof that he named it, but I have my ideas about why I think he may have named it. Now, the name appeared in October, a name appeared for the first time in October 1864. Tully couldn't have been back from Charleville very long. at that point. I assume he got back from Charleville at the very latest in, say, mid-September of 1864. And I assume he probably was in Charleville in late August or early September, something like that. But they had to rush the name out because the machinery was being put into action in relation to the first election for a member for Warrego, because there were elections coming on in March, I think it was, of 1865. And so the machinery of government had to, be cranked up and made to work. And so they had to give the place a name, and they had then to define polling places and all of those things that go on with running an election. So that's when we first hear about Charleville. But we don't hear why. Now, you might think, well, it was probably named Charleville because it was a common practice for surveyors to name the places that they had surveyed, places that were previously unnamed. And it didn't always happen, but it was frequently done by surveyors that they gave names, and provided that their names were, within limits, nothing too outrageous. I'm sure that if he had named Charleville Bubblegig or something like that. Now, Bubblegig, don't laugh. Because Bubblegig, I think, was the name that was originally given to about Wallal itself, or around Wallal, Bubblegig. In fact, I think there was a Bubblegig cricket team at one stage. I hope I don't mispronounce it, but it's something like that anyway. I would imagine that if he'd named it Bubblegig, well, they might have ruled that out. But Charleville, that was fair average quality sort of name, and so it was approved by whoever may have suggested it. Now you might think, well, okay, then if Tully named it, it must be in his diaries. But when I made inquiries about reading Tully's diaries, I discovered that there weren't any. Well, that's hardly surprising because he only did 2 pieces of surveying in Queensland. I mean, when I heard that the Surveyor General, and if you go into the Lands Office in Brisbane, oh, there he is, looking, well, a bit like one of those fellows in Twelfth Night, let no dog bark. When I speak, let no dog bark. Well, that's the impression you get from Tully's photo, and very grand indeed. But I thought, Surveyor General, he must have done lots and lots and lots of surveying and must have been the supreme surveyor, but not so. In fact, there are questions asked by some who know these things. How much surveying did he do? Well, in Queensland at least, not much. He did go up to Rockingham Bay and he spent, a real boy's own few months up there. Didn't do much. And there was good luck, I think, for the people of Cardwell because, of course it was called Rockingham Bay in the first instance, but a big party went up and Tully sort of tacked along as the third Commissioner for Crown Lands of a 2-man Crown Lands division, and the 2 other Crown Lands officers had already been appointed, and he was sort of tacked on because he had connections. See, and they had to give him a good job, and not only did they have to give him a good job, they had to give him a good title and probably a good salary and all that sort of thing. But he just went along, and the good luck was that he was not permitted to choose the town site. That was a communal effort. If you read the diaries of the period, they say we chose what seemed to be a pretty good town site, a long gravel ridge, I suppose, not far from the sea. I think they described it as a gravel ridge, maybe about 2 miles long, and they decided on the site for the town. And Tully then came in and did the technical surveying work, and allocated a few allotments for the settlers, of whom there were not many, and which is just as well because, excuse me, I'm getting on. It's a problem. if Tully had chosen the town site, he would probably have chosen a town site somewhere below high water mark. So a mercy was shown. Well, that was his first piece of surveying. And while a lot of surveyors did in fact name the places that they surveyed, that was not a gift given to Tully. The name had already been given, Rockingham Bay, and ultimately it was renamed Cardwell by whoever, but certainly it was not a name given by Tully. Now, Tully only ever did one other piece of surveying in his surveying career in Queensland, and that was his grand tour out to Charleville. And it's possible that Tully, knowing that this was his grand finale of surveying, because he knew that he was coming back to Brisbane to become Deputy Commissioner for Crown Lands. That was another gift that was given to him very early in the piece. And so he may have thought, look, this is probably the one I can make history, my own personal history. And I want to be known as the person who gave name to this place. It's my only chance. And so because it was his only chance in his whole career of naming a town, probably he did name the town because he knew he was going to have no other chance of doing it as a surveyor. And so I suspect that he was impelled by his notion of his place in history to be known as the person who gave the town of Charleville its name, and probably the person who gave Charleville its place in history, which I don't know whether he thought much about that, but anyway, maybe on the basis of it being his one and only opportunity of giving a name to a place that he actually chose to take it. Now, it has a problem, you see. Did he or didn't he do that? Now, if you read the newspaper reports of the period, you find that there was in fact an immediate reaction to what Tully did at Charleville in 1864. The town reserve was gazetted in January of 1865, and there was this fellow called Carl Choetun, who sometimes was known as Will Weasel and sometimes known as Western Pioneer and all that sort of thing. Now, I don't know who Choetun was. He seemed just to disappear from history from about 1868, I think it was. And but someone could probably discover, if they had the energy, discover who he was. But he was quite an impressive fellow. He seemed to know the ins and outs of what was going on in Brisbane, even though he was not a member of Parliament, and even though he was certainly not one of the Downsmen. But he knew the Downsmen, he knew quite a lot of Downsmen. But he seemed to have a huge amount of inside information. And that, of course, that's what puzzles me about it. How did he know all this inside information? And the interesting thing about it, too, is that not only did he know a whole lot of contemporary information, he seemed to be very, very intimately aware of Tully's familial history. Not the familial history in Ireland, but the familial history that came his way by his having married the daughter of Simeon Lord Jr., of course, of Avoca in Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania, but of course a member of the network of lords which had been based in Sydney on the basis of the work of Simeon Lord Sr. And Choetun seemed to know all about Simeon Lord Sr. and very, very, very intimate detail about all of this, which puzzles me. How did he know? Well, anyway, how do I know he knew? Well, I know he knew for this reason, that the Brisbane Courier edition that covered the Gazette news of the 11th of January 1865 would have arrived in Charleville in, about 2 or 3 weeks later, towards the end of January of 1865. Well, immediately Choetun saw this, he took pen to paper, and he told all. Well, it's a great pity that he didn't tell all in a rather more plain prose, but he seemed to know, and he seemed to want to say what had happened, or what he thought had happened, but he didn't like to say it directly, and so in his role as Will Weasel, he wrote a letter saying, "Hey, this place, Charleville, we've been talking lately about the origins of Queensland names. What about Charleville? What's its history?" So then in that edition of the Brisbane Courier whenever it was that his letter appeared, because he wrote his letter on the 8th of February, I think it was, and he then took over as Carl Choetun. He said, "Oh, well. He said, I can give you, it may not be generally known, but I can give you the history of Charleville." And so he proceeded to in a sense, dig the dirt, or dish the dirt on Tully. And but unfortunately, he didn't dish the dirt in a direct way. He wrote in a very facetious way, and when you read the letter that he wrote, it seems like nonsense, and no one's ever taken any notice of it, because it was very largely unintelligible, because it was written in this very facetious way. Now, I've been able to interpret about half of it, but no more than half of it, and maybe the half that I can't interpret is sort of, maybe he was going into the realms of fantasy at that point. But the first half of it was quite interesting, because what it says is this. He said, that man must have been mad. He has defined a town reserve at a flood site, at a site that everybody knows is flood prone and badly flood prone. And why did he do this? Well, he says he did it because he was supposed to go and survey some other place, which of course was Mangalore, and he didn't do it. But he did do it, and he seemed to be ignoring the fact that the debris from the March flood was way above his head. As many people subsequently said, the man must have been mad. And so he had no good to say about it, but he was anxious to say it quickly, but unfortunately he said it in a very indirect way, and so nobody took any notice of it. And so while in subsequent years lots and lots of people wrote to the various newspapers and said, look, this man must have been mad to do what he did. Why did he do it? They could have chosen a better site, all that sort of thing. They didn't really know anything about the forbidding of Tully, or whoever the surveyor may have been, to survey the township, as the Surveyor General had said at Mangalore. Now, no one knew that. They just complained subsequently about the fact that it was not a very good site. Now, I'm probably the only person who's ever seen that letter in the newspapers, but it's there if you want to see it. But, of course, I didn't discover it for 150 years or whatever it may have been, so, it sort of sat there. But the other thing about it, of course, is that there's another set of papers which are also not seen for 150 years. And these documents were in parts of the internal correspondence within the Lands Department. These are documents from about 1866. And for some reason or another, Gregory, the Surveyor General, felt obliged, for whatever reason, to write an explanation of, how this strange piece of surveying took place. Well, it was all for internal purposes that it was done, never made public, and so, again, nobody knew about the Mangalore prohibition, we'll say, for another 150 years, but there it was there just waiting for 150 years on to be revealed, by yours truly, you see. And so there we are. What had happened, according to Gregory, was this. Now, you believe this if you want. People clamoured for a town reserve, which would ultimately become a Charleville town or become a town, and which would then allow, of course, for the lock-up and the court and post office and so on, and which would also allow them to, get the title to the property upon which their improvements had been built. And so Gregory said, okay, well, we better send a surveyor out to survey a reserve out there. And the reports, probably from road surveyor Austin and, probably from the personal knowledge of Gregory himself and the personal knowledge of his brother, they determined that the best site for the township would be at Mangalore, because certainly they would have been aware that, so many places out there were flood prone. But they knew that the area around what we now call Baker's Bend was flood free. And so they determined that the town should be surveyed at Mangalore. And so Tully, Tully was told to go out and survey the township of Mangalore. Now, that's not quite what Gregory would have us believe. Gregory said that a party was sent forth to survey a township on the Warrego, which was, of course, become the capital of the Warrego area. But at the point that Tully left Brisbane, the exact site had not been determined. So anyway, Tully and his mates went off on horseback, heading for the Warrego. And only after Tully had departed was the decision made that the township should be surveyed, or the town reserve should be surveyed at Mangalore. Well, Tully'd already left, a day or two before, a week before, whatever it may have been. Riders were sent at the gallop after Tully to say, hey, it's not your own choice. The township or the reserve has to be surveyed at Mangalore. Well, said Gregory, bad luck. By the time the riders caught up with with Tully, he had already surveyed this Charleville site. And so it was too late. Tully surveyed the site, and apparently he gave the forks to Gregory and said, I've surveyed. In fact, came back to Brisbane and said, well, by the time I got your message, I'd surveyed the site and I certainly wasn't going to do another one. And so back he came. And then Gregory went on to say, well, Tully, maybe it wasn't too bad, because Tully thought that he was only supposed to be surveying a town site for immediate purposes, not for the long term, just immediate purposes. Well, if you believe that, you can believe anything. They sent a party off to do surveying, but they didn't tell them where. Own choice, wherever you like. Ha! And a rider sent at the gallop to tell him to go to Mangalore. And then when they justify the absolute unsuitability of the site, they say, yes, but he only thought he had to survey a temporary town site. What a load of bull. But anyway, there we are. So that was the background of that. But of course, the other part of it was this, that Tully had a protector, and I'm quite sure that Tully's protector right throughout his career was none other than Arthur Macalister. You don't think that Tully just came up to Brisbane, on a chance of picking up a job somewhere. You may be sure, Tully, they got out of Tasmania in 1862, and maybe he came up to Sydney just after that. But he came to Brisbane from Sydney in a boat, I think, called the Clarence. And I would say that the Tully clan the Lord clan in Sydney must have had contacts with Macalister in Brisbane, because Macalister had for a short time been a member of the New South Wales Parliament, and I think they must have said, will you look after our lad? And so when Tully arrived in Brisbane, well, he didn't arrive as just a plain old surveyor. Within weeks he was Commissioner for Crown Lands, and he was a law officer of the state. Oh boy, they showered stuff upon him. They made him the 3rd commissioner, and off he went on this jaunt up to the highly publicised Rockingham Bay expedition. And oh boy, he was looked after well and truly. And I will at some stage give you the dates of Tully's various appointments and the positions that Macalister held at that time. And what I find amazing is that suddenly Macalister gets a lift up in the hierarchy, and within weeks Tully gets a lift up in his own hierarchy. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. You know, I mean, I may be wicked, but that's how I see things. And of course this made Tully a brazen piece of work. He knew that he could do whatever he wanted, and he was absolutely immune to any sort of comeback from those who may have disapproved. And certainly he was immune, in his view, to any complaint against his conduct that may have been put there by Gregory, his boss. And you imagine, I mean, Gregory may have felt like kicking him in the bum when he got back to Brisbane and said, well, I surveyed this place at the upper crossing at Charleville. Gregory probably wanted to give him a good boot in the arse, as they say. Excuse the French. But what could he do? Because he knew that Tully was going to be his Deputy Commissioner or the Deputy Commissioner for Crown Lands. Well, you can't exactly boot him in the bum. So Tully just had to sort of bite his tongue. Or not Tully, Gregory just had to bite his tongue. He could do nothing. So anyway, there was our Tully, Deputy Commissioner for Crown Lands. Now, I then come to the argument that maybe he did name the town because it was his only chance of naming the town. But I also think that he had an ego. He seems to have been a dour sort of fellow. He appears not to have been a particularly liked fellow. Very august, let no dog bark and all that type of thing. If you read his, when he finally retired, they had a little get-together, and they gave him a purse of something, I don't know, a travelling clock or something, I would have thought. But they made speeches as they had to make speeches, but the speeches, I can assure you, were very, very lukewarm. Like the minister said, my dealings with him were always pleasant. He seems to have known what he was doing, and, oh God, I mean, if after all your years in the job and you retire in about 1900, 1901, whenever it may be, and that's the best you can do, you're in a bad way. And whereas on the other hand, if you contrast what was said of Gregory when he died, in the same year as Tully, 1905, Gregory was very, very warmly regarded in the state, and when he was booted out of the position of Surveyor General, the speeches that were given to him were very, very warm indeed. But that was not true of Tully. Tully was there, taking himself very seriously, and so he was a troublemaker from the beginning, and a troublemaker. Those who've worked in the public service will know perfectly well, know the breed quite well, and those who've worked in politics will know these are the great white hunters. And immediately Tully got the job of Deputy Commissioner for Crown Lands. Well, okay then. He give Gregory trouble, and there was almost open warfare between the two by about 1866. But there was already a Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands, a man named Lamb. Now, in 1866, Lamb resigned because of all the trouble that surrounded him. Well can I imagine. With the arrival of Tully was intent upon white-handing Lamb, and no doubt he white-handed Lamb and caused all sorts of trouble. Well, Lamb had a bit of a breakdown and he resigned. But 2 days later he said, oh look, I've changed my mind, I'm going to have my job back. But no. Arthur Macalister wanted Tully in the job of Commissioner for Crown Lands, Chief Commissioner for Crown Lands, and so, bad luck for you, Lamb, Tully is the new Chief Commissioner for Crown Lands. That's 1866, about 2 weeks after Macalister took over, I think, in one of probably his first stint as Premier, I think. And so Tully then aimed his venom at, Gregory. But he was able to do it very effectively because in 1866, not only did he become Chief Commissioner of Crown Lands, Macalister split up the department, and Tully became, after just 3 years in the employ of the Lands Department, he became the Under-Secretary of the department. Well, the Under-Secretary of the department is like the Director General of the department, and he was in charge of operating the workings of the whole department, which included the Surveyor General's department. So Tully was the Under-Secretary running the department in which his rival, Gregory, was at work. And he was in an excellent position just to continue white-anting Gregory. But Gregory's reputation was very great. And it took him until 1875 to get rid of Gregory. But again, when did this happen? Well, guess what? Macalister just happens to become Premier once again. And so he persuaded Macalister to consolidate what had been split in 1866, was put together again because it was split in 1866 and it suited the well-being of Tully. And then in 1875 it was put together again, this time again to suit the well-being of Tully. And so that's the beginning of Tully's career as Surveyor General. But no, he seems to be the most unpleasant piece of work, I can tell you. No, but that may be untrue. That's only my impression of the things. Well, okay, then, people wrote and they said he must be mad and why did he place the town where he did. But after a while, people forgot about it and they blamed God, I think, for all these floods and so on. But the town name, well, Tully appears not to have been his hometown. He was born in Dublin, as far as we know, and his mother was not born there. She was born in Wilton Castle. They were fairly big time in their own way. Fairly big time in a minor way in Ireland in the period. And so Charleville, well, I don't know why he named it Charleville, but my guess is that he did name it. But one of the reasons I think he probably did name it was because he was a totally unaware creature. He may have been a white-anter, he may have been a troublemaker, he may have been very august, he may have been let no dog bark, as I say, he may have been all of those things, but I think he was fairly unaware. Now look, if I had surveyed a town that everyone said, look, are you mad? If everyone had denounced me for years and say, you're mad, if I'd done a job as bad as that, and Tully's job was as bad as that, I think I would have let someone in head office do the name. I would have tried not to have been tarred with the brush of naming Charleville. In fact, I would have preferred that everyone forgot any involvement I had with the naming of Charleville, because it was such a shameful and shoddy piece of work, such an incompetent piece of work. But I think Tully didn't realise it. Tully must have been very happy with his work. Now you can't, either he was a man who listened to no one, or he was a very overbearing creature. But when he chose that particular spot, can you imagine that the people around about him didn't say, hey, is this really a good idea? Would C.C. Carter, who knew the area by that time reasonably well and knew the history of the flood, would he not have said something? But apparently either they remained dumb in the face of the august presence of Surveyor Tully, or they were just ignored. And so I think Tully probably thought he did a very good job. And shamelessly, or without shame, without embarrassment, he took the credit. And maybe he did take the credit because I think in 1931 his son, of his second marriage to the Darwell lady, declared, after the discussion of the naming of Charleville, that in fact his father had named Charleville. And that must have been the talk in the house. But of course that was 1931. The naming had taken place in 1864. Tully had died in 1905, and the general contents of E. Kivas Tully's letter to the Courier in 1931 were not particularly accurate, but nevertheless that was the talk within the home. And so Tully must have made some claims, I take it, within the home that he had done it, despite the shame that must have come his way of all the floods that had occurred by, well, certainly by 1931, certainly by 1905. Tully knew no shame. And I think that Tully was very pleased with himself, was very happy to name it. Now, why he called it particularly Charleville, I don't know, because it's certainly got nothing to do with people's, birthplaces and such things like that. The only thing I can think of is that he may have had a trip out to Charleville in Ireland at some stage and saw some bogs. And if you go to that, the little running ground near the crossing to Gowrie, just beyond that, there used to be, along the old Cunnamulla Road, a lot of billabongs there. Now, after 1864, they would all have been filled, and that ground would have been a little bit boggy and so on. And maybe Tully sort of looked at that area as he trudged around and thought, well, this reminds me of the bogs of Charleville Island or something like that. Maybe. Or maybe some other reason, I really don't know, but whatever, it didn't have much to do with his mother's birthplace or his birthplace or anything else. And then, of course, there's that other business that, what's his name, Morrison says that it was named after Charleville in Ireland and that derives from Charleville in France. I think Morrison was just displaying his geographical knowledge. Charleville in Ireland was the name Charleville because the Boyles, I think, who were the big-time title people of that area, they backed the wrong horse in 1849 or 1649. When Cromwell took over and headed the Commonwealth, the Boyles championed the Commonwealth, championed Cromwell. Well, that was all very well, but I mean, how do you feel and how do you fare when the Commonwealth comes to an end in 1660? Charles II comes back and the monarchy is reinstated. Well, you've got to keep on side. And so the Boyles decided they'd better show their loyalty to the new king. Now, the new king came over from France. If you read Pepys's diary, when Charles II came over, I think they had to have a bit of a whip around for him because he was pretty broke, but he had the breeding. They had a whip around and that set him up a little bit. And but he was known as a Francophile. He loved French things. And so Boyle decided to found a new town in that area, and he called it Charleville. Charleville, I tell you. Yes, this was to, Charles's town. Oh, God. Yes. This was a way of sort of getting back into the good books of the new regime, which was in London. Yes, Charleville. So Charleville, in fact, is Charleville, and it's got nothing to do with Charleville in France and so on. And so there we are. But I think, yes, he probably did name it because it was his only opportunity of naming it. And I think he felt so pleased with his work that he knew no embarrassment about it. I mean, he never came back, of course, because, people would have thrown rotten eggs at him, perhaps. But he never returned. But nevertheless, he probably treasured this notion, that his moment in history. Oh, dear. So, I don't know. I don't like to use French, but I don't think he was a very nice person. I can find nothing good about him. I can find nothing good that he did. I can find nothing good written about him. And so maybe I'm sort of jaundiced and maybe I'm being a bit unkind. But I think he was very pleased with his work and he wanted his moment in history as having named a town in Charleville. And I would be very surprised if that were not the case. But really, if he'd had any real awareness, he would have kept very, very quiet about it.